Howdy doody, my name is Susie, and today I thought I would share with you just a couple of different ways that you can preserve sage. It's ripe right now, we're in the middle of summer, and it's a very healthy plant. I thought you would like to know how to preserve it and how to use it in some different culinary applications other than just in poultry and using it to stuff a turkey and for your gravy at Thanksgiving. Now, sage is an ancient plant originally found in the Mediterranean. The Greeks and the Romans used it for medicinal and culinary purposes, and many other countries have adopted it because of its medicinal purposes and its delicious use in culinary dishes. Now, also sage may be better known to you and used for smudging, which has become quite popular. And this is an indigenous ritual that is performed for cleansing, purifying, and it has its healing and spiritual properties. I'm not an expert on it. I've never saged my home, but it is said to help purify the environment. And actually, in reading about this, there may be some very strong scientific evidence behind that, in that sage is supposedly, when you smudge it or when you smoke it in a room, the negative ions help neutralize the positive ions that are in the air. And positive ions aren't positive as in good, they are positive as in charge. And things like pollutants and dog dander and bacteria and mold, those types of things carry a positive charge. So when smudging and using the sage in a room and releasing those negative ions, it helps to purify the air and make it cleaner, and hence will promote clear thinking and clarity, etc. And that kind of segues into the next medicinal purposes for the sage. And this actually, in reading online, there are some studies, some scientific studies that are being done to study how sage and sage teas and oils can help in restoring cognitive thinking and enabling clarity of thought. It also is said to help in depression, which makes sense if it is clearing your head and improving your memory and is good for your brain. So that's a very interesting fact, which I urge you to take a look at on the internet and do your own research and find out more. The other thing that's really great about sage is that there are also scientific studies being done on how it can aid with menopausal symptoms, and specifically with hot flashes. So drinking sage tea actually in some studies helped to reduce the number of hot flashes. So that is another fantastic property for the sage. Sage has also been known to use for clearing up sore throats. So it's used as a gargle, and it is also said to help with cankers and help with gingivitis. So making a sage tea, letting it cool, gargling it either cool or hot, and rinsing your mouth is very good. Sage also has some really nice properties that aid in skin health, and actually clear sage essential oils are one of the ingredients that are used or will be found in many cosmetics. But for our purposes today, we're just going to be using this, and I'm going to be showing you how you can either dry or use the sage in a butter compound, preserve it in oil, use it as a tea, so that we can use it in our everyday. But the real highlight, or my favorite recipe, my favorite new way to have the sage is it's almost in a candied form, and I'm going to show you how to make that next. But first of all, sage is a great plant, and I was lucky enough to go to a friend's home who was actually growing sage, and gave me this beautiful bunch of sage. Let me show you where I got it from. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really done well this year. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think
done well.
it's fantastic.
It's healthy. It smells wonderful. Yeah, it's time for a bit of a harvest here.
So they were kind enough to share all this sage with me, and now I want to turn it into something delicious. I'm not going to be able to use it all, so this is what I've done to preserve it. Now, first of all, you want to obviously clean and dry your sage. I dry sage by throwing it in a little paper bag. I just take my whole bunch. You can remove the leaves. There is moisture in the stem, so by removing the leaves and throwing them in the bag, it will speed up the drying process. But in any regard, I just throw it in a bag and I just put it in a dark place. I leave the bag open, and in about 3 weeks, I have some beautiful dried sage like this. And sage is actually one of those herbs that retains the same flavor when it's dried as when it's fresh, at least in my opinion. Some herbs like basil, once they're dried, or parsley, the flavor is totally different. But with sage, I find that it really does keep that fragrance and that kind of that pungy kind of taste that's very recognizable in a recipe. So you want to use small amounts of it because it is quite strong. So in about 3 weeks, you have this, which is dried sage. If you want to take it one step further, then just take all your dried sage and either put it in a coffee grinder or a bullet and just pulsate until you get a fine powder, so you can save it in this form dry, which is great for teas, or if you just want to throw in that into sauces, soups, etc. If you want to grind it finely, then you have this nice powder that will be concentrated, obviously, to this, because there's more volume in this than that. And you can throw that into soups and stews. It goes great with not only meat and poultry, but it's delicious with potatoes and other vegetables. Another way that I like to preserve the sage is by putting it in a butter compound. So I just take a quarter of my pound of butter, so a quarter pound of butter, and I'll measure out approximately 6 tablespoons of chopped sage. So I just remove all the leaves of the sage, and I'm going to use about 6 tablespoons or 7 tablespoons, doesn't really matter. The more you use, obviously the stronger the flavor. But the goal is to remove all your little petals or all your little leaves, and then finely chop them to a size that you would like to have in your recipe. So if I was to chop up all my sage and measure it out, I'm going to want about a tablespoon per pat. And like I said, I'm going to get about 6 tablespoons or 6 pats of butter. So I would use about 6 tablespoons to a quarter pound of butter. And then I know if I chop it up in 6 pieces, I'm going to get a full tablespoon of fresh sage in the recipe that I'm using. So my butter is softened. I've left it at room temperature. And you can do this in a food processor, or if your butter is soft at room temperature, such as mine, then you can just do it this way. So depending on how much you like sage, use it accordingly. If you only like about a teaspoon of sage in your recipes, then you just chop up less. And then basically, you're just going to mix it up in your butter and fully combine that so that it is even distribution of the sage. So then I just take my butter and add it. Take your butter and then just roll it. And I just fold it in half and shape it. Very easy to shape, just like a little sausage like that. And then I throw it in a Ziploc. I can make as many butters as I like. I can just mark it. I throw it in my little freezer bag, and I'll throw it in the freezer. And the next time that I want to use some sage butter or a sage butter compound, all I have to do, unroll it, and then I can just slice off however much that I want. Also, if you want to use this on its own, then I would just add a bit more butter and fry it until the butter is browned. The browned butter with the sage has a beautiful toasty flavor that goes delicious over sweet potatoes, pumpkins, over baked potatoes with gnocchi. It's absolutely delicious sauce just on its own. So I'm gonna throw this in the freezer, whenever I need it, I'll have it. Another way that I preserve the basil is I put it on a plate like this, and I just took this out of the freezer, and these little leaves are frozen hard, and once I freeze them on the plate individually, then I can just pop them all into my freezer bag. Oops, that one's frozen to the plate. Pop them in my freezer bag, seal it up, and throw it back into the freezer. Whenever I need a leaf or two of sage, I can pop one out, and you can tell just by touching it, it melts. So it's the next best thing to having a fresh herb in your recipe by preserving it in this way. So I'm gonna throw this in the freezer. Don't forget to mark the date. Now, another great way to preserve the sage is by, again, doing the same thing that we did with the compote butter. And that is taking your sage, chopping up however much you use, putting it in an ice cube tray. So let's say you normally use about a teaspoon of sage per recipe. Then chop it all up, put a teaspoon in each one of your ice cube trays, top it off with olive oil so it's covered, and freeze it in the olive oil. Then you will have these beautiful cubes of the sage preserved in the frozen olive oil. You can pop out an ice cube and just let the oil melt into your recipe. All the while, it'll be cooking the flavors of the sage into your food, and that's another great way to preserve it. But for today's purposes, I wanted to show you different ways to use it. And one of the ways that you can use it is drink it as a tea. And drinking it as a tea is going to have those medicinal purposes that I was talking about in terms of improving memory, bringing clarity, clearing your head. Also, to use it as a tea for if you want to use it as a gargle or to clean your mouth as an antiseptic in your mouth. You can also use it by steeping the tea. So all I've done is taken a couple of tablespoons of the sage, fresh sage, or a small bunch of sage for a whole pot of tea. And then I've just poured boiling water over it, and I've allowed my tea to steep for 20 minutes. So I'm just going to taste it. It's very nice. It tastes a bit like chamomile tea. It's a very soothing flavor, and there may be even, if you really wanted to dissect it, there may be some very slight flavor of mint in there. Now this is great on its own. If you find that the tea is too bitter, then certainly add a bit of honey. And this is great to start you off in the morning, especially if it is said to give you some real boost in your cognitive alertness and awareness and clear-headedness. So this is definitely delicious, hot or cold. Nice. But my favorite way, and the most unusual way, I think, to have sage, and that is candied sage. And this is delicious as a garnish. It looks beautiful on pate or cheese or any little appetizer, that a savory appetizer that you would like to garnish. But I love eating it on its own. And all you have to do is we're going to remove the leaves. And this is nicer if you do it with larger leaves, especially if you're going to be serving it as a little snack, a little appetizer. I've served these at cocktail parties, and people are always curious to see what they're going to taste like. And if I have to be honest, they're not only curious, but they're a little suspicious that it will taste good, but they are always pleasantly surprised at the flavor. It's very unique, it's very different, and it is very delicious. So I've got enough leaves on my plate. And now I'm going to take this over to the stove, and we are going to fry these in a little bit of sunflower oil. So let's head over there and I'll show you the next step. So we're just going to turn our pan on medium high, and we're just going to add enough oil to fry. We're not deep frying. These are very small, delicate leaves. So and they fry very quickly. So we just want to heat up that oil enough so that when we drop in our sage, it will sizzle immediately. So that'll take about a minute to heat up. So I have my sage ready, and then I've just got a plate with just a paper towel just to absorb some of that oil once the leaves are actually fried. My test leaf to get, and basically that's how hot you want the oil. So then you're just going to drop all your leaves into the oil, and I would only do a few at a time because it goes very quickly. So it has crispened, and you just want to get those little leaves out of the oil, a couple at a time, because it goes quite quickly over. It's really just seconds that it takes. Fry those on both sides. This one's done. And then quickly just put them on your paper towel. And here are our crispy leaves. At this point, we're just going to throw a little bit of sea salt on it. So we'll just throw a little sea salt. Throw the sea salt on now while they're hot and they have a bit of oil, because it will adhere. So now we have our fried sage, and I leave it on my paper towel until I'm actually ready to serve it. You don't want to add this necessarily to something that is wet, because it'll just reconstitute the leaf, it'll get limpy. And part of what makes it special is that it is a crunchy, crispy, like a chip-like treat. So normally I would serve it, if I was serving it as an appetizer, like I said, it goes great with some cheese, and you can garnish it with 2 or 3 leaves. And it really looks beautiful and makes a little appetizer very, very special. But the final ingredient on our sage leaves is, so you fried it, you've added the little bit of salt, so you have that fried sage flavor with the salt, and then you're going to just drizzle like this. Just drizzle a little bit of honey, and the flavor combination is really special. I love it. It is so unique that if you serve this to your friends or family, I know that they're going to find it very enjoyable. And that is some sage advice. So if you like this recipe and you try to preserve it these different ways, I hope that you share it. And if you do try making these, if only out of curiosity, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Enjoy!